Hey everybody, it's Chris from Beer Bearings, and I am doing something a little bit different this week. Happy Friday, by the way. And tell me what's in your glass if you've got anything going on today. And I'm actually responding this week to a viewer question from YouTube, where we had somebody ask, what's the difference between East Coast and West Coast IPAs? And what's the deal with East Coast IPAs? And which West Coast IPA should I be drinking? Which East Coast IPA should I be drinking? So I thought that was really interesting. There is no shortage of internet content. There are internet servers everywhere that are chock full of people with who have written opinions and people who have written style guides and all sorts of things about telling the difference between the two. And I thought I would take my opportunity to break that down for you a little bit today. There's some great content on YouTube for it as well. And I'll put a couple of links to those to some of my fellow YouTube creators down in the notes that follow. So let's kind of just dive right in. I'm going to open each of these beers that I've got in front of me first, because I think one of the first things that strikes you about the difference between these two beers is that one is pretty hazy and the other one is not, and the colors are different. So there's a lot we can talk about even before we take a sip or even get the aroma from it. So I have two New Orleans beers with me today. One that I actually did a video on a couple of weeks ago. It's called Vacation Juice. It's from Second Line Brewing, which is up by the cemeteries, essentially, by City Park. And then Faubourg West Wego, which is a West Coast style beer, West Coast style IPA from Faubourg, which is the newly renamed Faubourg out in New Orleans East. So without further ado, I'm going to pour these. I actually got some water with me this week too, because it's a good idea to have a little water to cleanse your palate between two very different beers like this. So that's what's going on also. But let's get the beer in the glasses, and see what's happening. So first of all, foam everywhere, including on my shirt. Taping live, folks, taping live. All right, so this is the Hazy IPA. Again, it's Vacation Juice from Second Line. And it's really one of my favorite hazies around right now in New Orleans. And this one is Faubourg West Wego. West Wego, for those of you who may not know, if you're not from New Orleans, is right across the river from City Park, which if you're not, or from, sorry, Audubon Park, which if you're not from New Orleans won't make any difference to you. But that's where it is, right across the Mississippi River from just a little bit uptown of where we are now. So I'm gonna put a little more in this glass. But you can already see there's a pretty big difference just in color alone and haziness in these two beers. Now, this one is opaque. This is the Hazy IPA. It's pretty much opaque. I can see a little bit through it, but not very much. They both have a nice, persistent white head, and there are some reasons for that we can talk about. We've talked about that a little bit before. We'll also talk about why this one is hazy and why this one is not. And interestingly, both of these actually use a whole lot of the same hop. They just use them differently and at different times in the process. So it's kind of cool. We can talk about it. So what are these two beers like as far as palate goes? So generally speaking, and there are all kinds of ranges of haziness and flavor and all that, but generally speaking, East Coast IPA is going to be a really pillowy, soft palate. So there's lots of body to the beer. There's a less perceived carbonation, although I'm not sure there's actually less carbonation going on in most of these. They're probably all carbonated to around the same amount. They tend to be fruity in their presentation, all from hops. 100% of that derived from hops. So let me get a taste of the Vacation Juice. I'm kind of expecting alcoholic fruit juice. Nothing wrong with that. And that's what I've got. And these are very refreshing. So that's got a nice soft mouthfeel. I get a lot of kind of tangerine, other sort of citrus aromas on this. And this is a beer, actually, most beers change flavor, all beers change flavor as they warm up. This one is one I think is actually a little bit better really cold. It's more refreshing that way, in my opinion. As you can see, as I'm swirling, we're getting more of that head to present itself there a little bit. So yeah, very juicy, very refreshing, ends with some sweetness and a little tiny bit of bitterness. And that's one of the main differences between this. So again, the main differences are you can't really see through it, although there are some that you can see through better. Very fruity in the presentation, all hop driven, and finishes sweeter and just a little tiny bit of bitterness right on the back end. But one that's really refreshing and satisfying. Now this guy, wait, water. West Coast style IPA. These tend to be a lot clearer. This one actually has a bit of haze. That could actually be chill haze. I just took it out of a very cold refrigerator. But also there might just be a little bit of haze left over from the process. That's not a big deal. A lot of these tend to be crystal clear. This one doesn't, and that's okay too. Typically you're gonna get very different hop presentation in this one. So there's a lot of dry hopping here, as there is in this beer, which means hops added during fermentation. So let me get a sniff here. Right, so here we got much more kind of dank, piney, resinous sort of hop notes coming out of this because they use different hops, and we'll talk about it. And let me get the flavor for you. Yeah, nice pungent kind of, again, piney, resiny. A little bit of fruit, but pithy, like grapefruit, that sort of thing. And this finishes a lot drier, leaves a really nice residual bitterness on your palate, which the combination, I think, of those two things, the dryness and the residual bitterness, really want to make you take that next sip, which I'm not going to do right this minute. So where did these beers come from? How did we get here? Most things in American brewing you can trace back to England, or at least to the UK, what is modern day UK. In this particular case, this style is older. There was a brewery in Burton-on-Trent in England that first brewed something pretty similar to this, although as an English beer, much less hoppy, much less about the bitterness and the overall kind of hop presentation. West Coast IPAs really started to be made at the kind of the dawn of the craft brewing era, if you will. So way back in the 80s and 90s. Again, we've talked about Anchor Steam beer on this channel before, and the West Coast IPAs were a kind of a turned up version of that. So the American brewers who got hold of the IPA decided, you've heard me say this before, decided to turn up all the knobs and push all the levers out on the soundboard, if you will, or the hop board, all the way to max. There is actually quite a lot of malt in here, but you can see by the color that you might get malts like Cara Red or Vienna malts, and this one, the reverse is true. This is obviously made with a lighter malt. That's one of the big things about this. Tons and tons of hops in here. Bittering hops are added at the beginning of the process during the boil, and they will have probably added hops several times in the boil here. The earlier in the boil you add hops, the more bitterness comes through. The later, it's more about aroma and flavor. So there are definitely some early bittering hops added here. And it's the type of hop as well that changes. So this one is Centennial and Cascade, if memory serves. And those are known for more kind of pithy fruit flavors and a little bit of pine and resin as well. I certainly get the pine and resin. I also get lots of grapefruit, maybe a little bit of like a papaya or passion fruit, something kind of that's a little more on the savory side, as our English cousins would say. So those are the big differences, and also much more bitter. This is also an 8% IPA, so it actually is, it's on the very verge of being a double or an imperial IPA as well, certainly by English standards. So that's a little bit about the West Coast IPA. As you can tell, I love it, so another sip for me. As far as the East Coast IPA goes, in my mind, this is a real response to this style of beer. So the West Coast IPA was the style that most brewers were making, craft brewers were making back, from the 90s, 80s, 90s forward. And then about the early 2000s, the pendulum sort of swung and tastes changed a little bit. And obviously manufacturers, brewers are also taste makers to a large extent. So that's what happened over here. The very first hazy IPA that was released was one called Heady Topper from The Alchemist. And it really kind of blew everybody away. It was very controversial. as well because it's so different from the West Coast styles. And this is the beer that's really taken over at this point. There are a lot of people who don't actually know, if they're newer to craft beer, have never tasted a beer like this. They've been really tasting and experiencing these East Coast IPAs, New England IPAs, hazy IPAs, all different words for the same thing, essentially. And so if you put one of these in their hand, they would probably they may love it, first of all, which would be great because I do, or they may not. But either way, these are really taking the market by storm. These are easy to find anywhere near you. Any craft brewery that is operating near you, I can guarantee you, has one or more of these on the inventory. And same thing with national breweries also. So how do brewers make these two very different beers using, the same ingredients essentially? And the answer is that pretty much everything is different in the brewing process between West Coast and East Coast style IPAs. In fact, that was the first word out of one brewer's mouth that I heard recently on an interview. Asked, what's the difference? He said everything. So the water chemistry is different. The malt is different. The yeast is different. And the hops are different, added at different times. Although they may both be American styles of hops, you're going to tend more toward one and the other with different styles, and you're absolutely going to add them at different times. So everything is different between these two. Let's go through that step by step. So very basically, water chemistry is a huge thing with beer. 95% of what's in your glass is water. And in the West Coast style IPA, it's about, the ratio is roughly 2-to-1 chlorides to sulfates. Don't worry about that. What that means is that chemical setup or that water chemistry will actually accentuate the bitterness and accentuate the hop flavors that are in this beer. The ratios are flipped on this one. So this one is 2-to-1 sulfates to chlorides. And that has kind of the opposite effect. It decreases your awareness of the bitterness and accentuates your awareness of some of those more fruity and softer flavors in that, okay? Water is a huge thing. Modern brewers can strip water of all of its contaminants and impurities and build back the water chemistry that they want. And that is something that allows them to make these two styles in one brewery, maybe in the same day, even on the same brew house. It's interesting in and of itself, just water chemistry and modern brewing techniques. Okay, malt. So I alluded briefly to the malt previously. This one is going to have, as you can see, darker in color. So maybe some Vienna malt, maybe some Cara Red, something like that, that's been kilned a little bit darker and maybe even stewed to give it some caramel characteristics. And this one certainly has some of that. This one is going to be made with much lighter malts that are kilned to a much lower degree of darkness and not stewed, and there won't be as much caramel going on, in fact none. More biscuity, more kind of bready, biscuity malts, so very different in that respect. On this side, these are very clean yeasts. These are yeasts that attenuate out fully, meaning they brew out fully, they brew out all the sugars. These are not usually very sweet, maybe a slight sweetness from the malt in these, but you're not going to get a whole lot of residual sweetness left in these beers when it's all over with, and it finishes very dry, and that's very much yeast and process driven. So over here we're talking about yeast that actually create fruity esters to accentuate the fruitiness from the hops. So what does all that mean? So during the fermentation process, this type of yeast will actually start to break down not just the sugars from the malt, but also some of the other compounds that are in the beer, so hop compounds, for example, and so on, and produce different chemicals, different compounds that give you a fruity flavor or a fruity kind of presentation. English beers are very famous for this. So if you can go, especially if you go to the source and find yourself an English ale and English IPA, you will be able to taste that much more cleanly because there's a lot less going on in those beers. So I highly encourage you to do that. Plus, I love England, so I can't wait to get back when we can travel freely and fully again. And now hops. Over here, hops at the boil accentuate bitterness. Hops all throughout the process, all throughout the fermentation process. Usually tons of dry hopping too to accentuate aroma, but again, they're different hops. Typically, these are American hops that tend to accentuate things like resin, pine, floral notes and flavors, and that's definitely what's going on in this beer. And then over here, it's hops added later in the process, not at the boil, whirlpool, and downstream in fermentation. And they will actually crash it cold and add even more hops to it at the very end to promote aroma. So you get the idea. Hops later, hops earlier, and different kinds. And then here's the big question. Why is this beer hazy? The answer in one word is polyphenols. The longer answer is that the brewer, when they put the malt bill together for this, will add flaked oats and unmalted wheat to these beers almost universally. I've never basically heard one without the other. And what that does is add extra protein to the beer as it's being fermented, and that will allow hop particles to attach or bond with the proteins to make polyphenols. And what that really means is it makes a slightly bigger molecule, right, that makes haze, promotes haze like this. So that is the explanation for how the beer gets hazy. Those are all my answers about that. In terms of which one I like better, I was born and raised almost in craft beer on West Coast IPAs. I was living in Denver back in the mid-90s. Yes, I am that old. And these were the beers that were current back then, and other variations as well. So, you know, things like Lagunitas and Stone and all of that. I still love those beers. I will search those beers out every chance I get. There's a bit of nostalgia in it. It's almost like eating your mother's apple pie or you know, whatever does it for you. So always search these out. I love the really floral ones, and those are getting kind of harder and harder to find. This one is a really nice local example though, and it definitely sort of scratches that itch in my palate, if you will. The East Coast IPAs I have really grown to appreciate and love in some cases. This particular one, Vacation Juice from Second Line, is maybe my current favorite in terms of a sort of all-around just hazy IPA that's kind of always in their rotation. But there is no problem finding these now because they are absolutely everywhere. I hope that I've done a relatively adequate job of explaining the differences between these two. And I hope that you will bring your friends into the Facebook group or like and subscribe on YouTube if you would like to see more of this kind of content. And I would love to hear from you on either of those platforms to tell me what else you'd like to see me talk about. But for now, I'm going to grab the hazy, surprise, and tell you that I hope you really enjoyed this. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next time on Beer of the Week. Bye-bye.